Welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. Today we're looking at two stories in Mark chapter 7. They're two healing stories, and they're on the lectionary for this coming Sunday. And I want to structure this study, as I structure every study, around the three P's: prayer, perspective, and pieces of Scripture. So the prayer for today comes from a book by theologian Bruce Epperly. The book is titled Praying with Processed Thought. And here's the prayer. Holy God, there is much wreckage in our world and our lives. We confess our brokenness and the areas of our lives where we have harmed others and the earth. Help us to claim our vocation as your healing partners, bringing forth beauty and healing to every life and to the world as a whole. Amen. Okay, now for the perspective, and every time I do one of these studies, I like to talk about a perspective, just to give us another vantage point or another angle, another lens to look at what are sometimes very well-known biblical stories, but with another angle on them, we can see things that we may not have seen before. And today's perspective is drawn from a new book in New Testament studies that I just finished reading. This is the book right here by Robin Faith Walsh, The Origins of Early Christian Literature. Now, I think this book could be a game changer in the field of Gospels studies in particular, because it changes how we look at the Gospel writers themselves, of which, of course, Mark was one. And again, we're looking at two stories from the Gospel of Mark today. Now, generations of Gospels scholars have treated the Gospels more or less as reflections of individual communities or individual churches that, it's assumed, these Gospel writers are writing to. And the thinking has been that the Gospel writers inherited traditions about Jesus that were forged in the contexts of these early Christian communities or churches. A bit like campfire stories that are shared and then reshared and passed on to subsequent Christians, and then ultimately taken up into these Gospels by these gospel writers. It's a kind of back and forth writing process. Stories about Jesus are told and retold and circulated among early Christian communities or churches, and then individual communities, certain stories get told and told even more, and then those communities influence how the gospel writers write what they write. Now, scholars have tried to sift through the Gospels in order to figure out which pieces of the Gospels originated or were shaped within these communities, and which pieces of the Gospels originated or were shaped by the writers themselves. Whole industries in New Testament studies have emerged trying to sift through the Gospels to trace particular traditions back to particular groups, whether it's written sources or oral sources, on it goes. And then, as you work through this process, other scholars have come along, scholars who are interested in the actual historical Jesus, and they've tried to sift through all of these stories to isolate those bits and pieces that they think go back to the real historical Jesus, whether it's sayings or stories or deeds that he did, etc., etc. Now, those of you who have either read my work or have listened to these studies that I've led on Thursdays, you know that I am skeptical of this whole process. In particular, I'm skeptical about whether we can actually sift through the Gospels to identify those bits and pieces that go back to the actual historical Jesus. And one reason why I'm skeptical is that there are almost as many reconstructions of Jesus' life and times as there are scholars who've written on the topic, which suggests that scholars' reconstructions of the life and times of Jesus tell us more about the scholars themselves and what they're interested in than about who Jesus was or what he did. Reconstructing the life and times of Jesus has been a bit like peering into a mirror. and scholars see their own quote-unquote reflections peering back, or their own perspectives peering back at them. Now, what Robin Faith Walsh does that's so interesting in this book is that she takes the focus off of communities and communities as influencers of these gospel writers, and she puts the focus on the writers themselves. So she's not interested in speculating about what can actually be traced back to communities or even back to the historical Jesus himself. She's much more interested in the writers as producers of literature, cultural producers, she calls them. And she rightly points out, in my opinion, that we have almost no evidence for early Christian communities behind the Gospels. All we have are what the Gospels tell us, which is very, very little. So almost no evidence of these communities in the first place. But we do have lots of evidence about ancient writers and ancient writing practices. So, she argues, we should focus on learning more about the gospel writers themselves because they were, after all, ancient writers. Now, here's what she says in one place about ancient writers. She writes, "Ancient Greek and Latin authors describe themselves writing within and for literary networks of fellow writers, not writing to and for individual communities." So, ancient writers, whether writers of biographies or histories or novels or even, in our case, gospels, were writing to and for small groups of other writers, not to and for groups of communities or churches. So they're writing to and for literary networks that they were a part of. Now, ancient writers, in terms of the practice itself, what they would do is they would write drafts or work on drafts of their publications. And before they were actually widely circulated, those writers would first circulate drafts to the people in their literary network to get feedback from them, which is not unlike what writers today do. We often circulate drafts of our work to close friends or colleagues before we publish them. So what all this means for us as modern readers and interpreters of the Gospels is that we should focus on the Gospels as we have them and not try to speculate too much about the communities behind the Gospels, or indeed speculate too much about whether the Gospels preserve the actual words and deeds of the actual historical Jesus. The Gospel writers took sources and materials that they were working with, and they reworked them in a creative way. They painted portraits of Jesus. Now, painting is a work of art. It is a representation. So it's less interesting to probe through that representation to see if it actually goes back to the figure it's representing, in this case, Jesus, and more interesting to focus on the representation itself and ask questions around what the gospel writers were doing when they wrote in the ways that they were writing. So let me give you an example of how scholars for generations have typically treated texts in the Gospels. So you pick up almost any standard commentary written by a scholar on, say, the Gospel of Mark. Most of those scholars will speculate about the imagined community or church behind Mark's Gospel, or the community or church Mark was writing to, the assumed community. Mark chapter 13, to take one example, talks about persecution. So, scholars who are interested in communities, when commenting on Mark chapter 13, will often assume that Mark's community or church faced persecution. Why else would Mark mention persecution, if not because his community was being persecuted? The assumption would then lead other scholars to speculate on the kinds of persecution that Mark's community may have faced. And then other scholars will come in and ask questions that are even broader. Well, what kinds of persecution did early Christians writ large face in the first century when Mark was writing? Because, so the argument goes, Mark talks about persecution Therefore, Mark's community must have been persecuted. Therefore, they must have been persecuted for being followers of Jesus. Therefore, early Christians must have been persecuted. And on it goes. By the way, there is almost no evidence, or very little evidence, that early Christians were persecuted for being Christians in the first century, which is different to how many Christians were treated in subsequent centuries in the Roman Empire. But in the first century, there's very little evidence that they were persecuted for being Christians, in part because the Romans didn't even recognize a distinction between Christians and other religious groups. They saw the Christians as part of Judaism itself. Now, Robin Walsh, in her book, would say, I think, that this entire discussion about communities and persecution writ large among early Christians, when all of it goes back to this assumption that Mark was writing to a specific community, the entire discussion, I think she would say, is misplaced and misguided. It's mere speculation. Mark's primary audience, she would say, is fellow writers, a literary network, not a specific community. So, maybe Mark wrote about persecution because Mark wanted to intensify the drama in his gospel. Or maybe one of Mark's written sources talked about persecution, and so Mark took that on and wove it into his own gospel. The point is that just because Mark talks about persecution doesn't mean that there's a community behind the gospel that was being persecuted, because, again, Mark's primary audience was fellow writers, a literary network. Now, you've heard me say this before, but I like to think about the New Testament gospel writers as artists, literary creatives who painted their own distinctive portraits of Jesus. So the questions for us as modern readers, if we come at the Gospels from that perspective, are how does the Jesus Mark paints speak to us today? How does the Jesus Mark paints help us to make meaning as Christians today? So these are the kinds of questions that get us into the world of our own journeys of faith and how we can use or wield the Gospels to help us along and to help us live with meaning and purpose today. So all of that brings us to the third P, which is pieces of Scripture. And today, again, we're looking at two stories from Mark chapter 7, starting in verse 24. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Jesus said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Now the second story starts in verse 31. Then Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon, towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." Now, that's a challenging text, both for the regions that are named in terms of pronunciation and also for the Aramaic word meaning be opened. Now, okay, Mark tells two stories here, two stories in tandem, and both of them, in terms of setting, take place in Gentile territory. So in verse 24, at the beginning of the first story, Jesus is in the region of Tyre, which is north of Galilee along the coast. Then in verse 31, the beginning of the second story, we're told that Jesus was in the region of Decapolis, also predominantly Gentile territory. In the broader literary context around these stories, the context of the gospel itself, Mark has set readers up to receive, so to speak, these two healing stories, or the message in these two healing stories. So if we were to go back to the beginning of chapter 7 and read Mark's setup work, so to speak, we would find a story that seems to be about arcane rules pertaining to ritual washing of hands and which foods are permitted to be eaten. In that story, early in Mark chapter 7, Jesus is debating with religious leaders about these religious traditions pertaining, again, to hand washing and which foods can be eaten. And what's surprising about that story is that Mark presents Jesus as making a rather stunning claim. In verse 19 of chapter 7, Mark says that Jesus, quote, declared all foods clean. Now, this is a reference to the kosher laws that governed foods for faithful Jews, or governed which foods that faithful Jews could eat. So, in effect, perhaps for dramatic effect, Mark's Jesus is presented as overthrowing centuries of religious tradition. Now, by the way, when we look at the parallel version of this story in Matthew's gospel, Matthew eliminates that reference to Jesus making all foods clean, I think, because in Matthew's mind, that went too far. That was to overturn a religious tradition that Matthew thinks is important. So after making this declaration about food being clean in verse 19, Jesus in Mark chapter 7 goes on to say that the most important thing when it comes to morality, that's where he transitions, he goes from these rituals to the bigger issue of morality, is the issue about morality is not whether a person faithfully observes certain customs. Rather, what Jesus says, what's important is what's going on inside the person's heart. That teaching sets the stage for the two healing stories that we're looking at today, the ones that we just heard. Because if external rituals and customs matter less than the internal state of the heart, then Jesus can reach out across boundaries to meet with Gentiles. You can cross that ethnic and religious boundary because Gentiles also can be recipients of God's grace. In fact, to press this point further, external differences between people, whether differences around race or creed or custom or ritual or language or whatever it is, while I think God celebrates this kind of diversity, at the end of the day, none of these externals determines whether a person is more worthy to receive God's grace than another. God doesn't love a person more because they're American or because they're white or because they speak English. God doesn't love them more because they claim to be Christian. God's grace is not selective grace. And at the level of the human heart, beneath all of these external differences, we're all human beings with beating hearts. So in a way, the story earlier in Mark chapter 7 sets up the recognition that these externals that make these two people Jesus heals different on the surface, really those externals don't even matter. Because at the end of the day, these two people, even though they're in Gentile territory, they're Gentiles, they probably are of a different religion and certainly not Jews, even though all of those things mark them out as different, at the end of the day, they're just human beings. And that really is the point of the story. That all of us, if we were to extrapolate, are created in God's image, and all of us are God's children and worthy to be recipients of grace without exception or distinction. Because, and this is a theological point, if grace isn't for all without exception or distinction, then grace isn't for anyone. Now, Mark hammers home this point in both of these healing stories. So in the first, Jesus encounters what Mark says is a Syrophoenician woman. Mark actually calls her explicitly a Gentile in verse 26. And when she meets Jesus, she drops to her knees and begins to beg him to heal her daughter. Jesus responds in a pretty rude way to her. He says, "Let the children be fed first, for it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Now, the word dog was an epithet that Jews would sometimes use when referring to Gentiles. It's a terrible thing to say to another human being. It seems that even Jesus in this story, the way he's portrayed, even Jesus in this story seems not to have fully grasped the point that he himself made earlier in chapter 7, namely, that the heart is what matters most to God and not external differences of ethnicity or religion or whatever else. Maybe Mark presents Jesus this way to illustrate just how difficult it is for people to look beneath the surface of our differences to see the human being with the beating heart inside. Now, the woman immediately pushes back on Jesus, and she turns that epithet around. She says, "Even a dog deserves crumbs. I may be different," she says to Jesus, "but I'm still a person." Of course, he goes on then to heal her daughter. In the second story, Jesus is in a different region, but it's still Gentile territory. And there he meets a man who could not speak or hear. The man can't advocate for himself, so it's his friends who bring him to Jesus and then beg Jesus to heal him. The implication is that his friends are Gentiles too. All of them are human beings with beating hearts. Jesus heals the man. Again, if grace isn't for everyone without exception or distinction, then it's not grace. If there are qualifiers on grace, then it's not grace. Just a side note here. Mark presents Jesus in this second story as healing using techniques that were commonly used among healers in the ancient world. So in this story, Jesus touches the man's ears. He puts his fingers in the man's ears, and then he spits, and it touches the man's tongue. It's not clear if he spits on the tongue or if he spits in his hand and touches the tongue, but the spittle becomes an agent of healing. But the point is that this is a technique, and there are common techniques in the ancient world that healers use to try to bring about healing, and Jesus is using techniques here that are common in the ancient world. So he touches the man's ears, the spit touches the man's tongue, and then Jesus looks up to heaven and sighs, or groans. Now, the word that's used there, the Greek word, is actually a healing term in the sense that what it means is almost like channeling or connecting. So Jesus is connecting himself or opening himself up or channeling this healing Spirit of God that will flow through him and then ultimately heal the man. So the scene, as Mark depicts it, is a scene that Mark's readers in his literary network would have known from other stories that they might have read about healers in the ancient world. Now, as with all of the healing stories in the Gospels, it's easy for us as modern readers to get lost in the eye-catching headline. So we might summarize these two stories under the headline, Jesus miraculously heals a woman's daughter and a man who can't speak or hear. The glitzy headline, the bling. It can be distracting. It can pull us away from the layered, richer sense that there are many possible meanings in these two stories and in the healing stories more broadly. So the challenge for us as readers is to kind of probe through the headline and the glitz and the glamour and the bling of the healing itself and focus on other possible meanings that are timeless in a way, that go back to those questions I was inviting us to ask earlier about how does the way Mark presents Jesus, how does that help us now to make meaning and purpose in our own lives? So if we just focus on the healing story, just focus on the headline, we get a one-dimensional sense when we read these stories. But if we probe beneath the headline and we look at other possible meanings, we can actually transcend and transcend the boundaries of time and culture that this story is confined in. We can come outside of those and see how this story might speak today. Because the healing stories in the Gospels are richer and more layered with meaning than the simple headline. So these two stories, it seems to me, have a lesson embedded within them about reaching across the externals of boundaries that divide and create differences or highlight differences between human beings. These stories teach about crossing those kinds of boundaries, because Mark, the gospel writer, wasn't making this kind of a point to a specific community, urging them alone to cross boundaries or to model the healing ministry of Jesus. Mark, in a way, is speaking in a more timeless way. The advantage of seeing him as speaking to a literary network is that his work kind of moves outside of certain confines and now operates at a broader cultural level that can transcend time and have a kind of timeless energy about it. So how we might bring this forward to today is, you just read the news and you see divisiveness all the time. It seems so rampant right now in our culture. And that might not be fair because we've always been or always had or experienced divisiveness, but it does seem very intense right now. And in particular, there is this sense of being fearful of or being angry at a person who is an other. But stories like these two healing stories, can be a reminder to us that there are no others, strictly speaking, in the world. Because every human being has a beating heart beneath the externals of difference. Every human being has a beating heart, even and especially those who are most unlike us.